So I'm going to show you this picture here first, and then I'm going to come back to it at the very end. And one of the things that is sort of the underlying principle with a lot of the work that I do is that we know from really large-scale studies that there are health differences in terms of minority status. So we know that there are physical differences like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, blood pressure, where racial minorities and other types of minorities are higher in these types of things. And we also see things related to negative psychological things as well. And the underlying principle is that we believe that discrimination might be one of the things that's contributing to that effect. That we know that chronic stress in particular is really, really linked to these negative heart disease and negative cardiovascular sort of diseases. And we can conceptualize that more basically as stress, right? So in the case of minority individuals, it might be discrimination, but for anybody, any type of chronic stress is related to this type of negative health outcomes. And I should mention too that at Portland State, we have a really strong emphasis on occupational health psychology. So my part of that is looking at diversity and how diversity and diverse identities contributes to health and health in the workplace. So that is one of the basic underlying principles, and I'm going to take you through like some of the research that I've been doing, starting at the very beginning. When I started in grad school, I was really focused on identity management. So this idea that some identities are readily apparent, like race in most cases, gender in most cases, but there are other identities that aren't readily apparent. Things like sexual orientation in most cases, political affiliation, religious affiliation. And when we're talking about things like that, we're talking about disclosure. So there's some sort of hidden characteristic that potentially could be stigmatized in a social context, and we're interested in seeing how managing that identity impacts the person that is managing the identity and also impacts the coworkers and the organization and all of that. So we did a lot of different studies looking at identity disclosure and found basically that if you disclose your identity or if you acknowledge your identity, and basically the idea is that you're authentic in your identity, you can be yourself at work and not have to censor yourself, then that is related to really positive job outcomes, things like job satisfaction, organizational commitment, perceptions that you fit in with the rest of your coworkers, and then lowered stress and turnover retention. So that is good for authenticity and it makes sense. And one of the things that we also saw was that if you ask people, rates of disclosure, because most people think, well, why would you disclose something that could be stigmatized, because then you're just opening yourself up for discrimination. And in fact, about 60% of folks do disclose actually in interview and selection context. The time that's the most high stakes, you would think, I'm not going to say anything until I get the job. A lot of people are saying, no, I actually want them to know because this may not be a good place for me to work if they don't appreciate who my identity is. So we do find that relationship to be relatively strong, but we wanted to see also what is contributing to that relationship. So it's not just disclosing and then I'm happy. There are other things that are going on, right, psychologically. And what we looked at and what we found over the course of several different studies is that coworker support seems to be the thing, the mechanism, the explanatory psychological thing that's happening where you disclose an identity, and if your coworkers are supportive, then that leads to feelings of authenticity and affirmation of your identity, and then that seems to explain why those attitudes are more positive, right? And we saw this in gay and lesbian employees, we saw this in transgender employees, we saw this in cancer survivor employees, and other labs have looked at this sort of model, this general model with other types of identities, and we see the same thing over and over. It's really coworker support. So that's sort of one piece of information from grad school. Another thing that we looked at is, okay, what if we look at disclosure relative to other types of things that might be happening? So we have disclosure, coworker support, and then we added organizational policies. This was another study looking at the experiences of transgender folks. And we wanted to see what would be related to discrimination, perceptions that the climate is a bit hostile. So we entered all of these into a regression. We did a relative weights analysis, which gives us the it sort of answers the question of like which one's most important in predicting these perceptions. We found that all three did predict, so they're all important, but the one that had the most weight associated with it was coworker support. So that's kind of what we expected based on the other stuff, but we're sort of building this case, right, as we go along. The last bit of background information that I'm going to give you is another study that we looked at. This is again with transgender employees' experiences, and this time we wanted to see how not disclosing, but actually transitioning in the workplace impacts job attitudes. So we asked people who were at varying stages of their transition about their job attitudes, and generally what we found is that yeah, the further along people are in their transition, so we ask people, you know, you're just beginning, you haven't started, you're in the middle of transitioning, or you feel like you've fully transitioned or are near completion of transitioning, the people who are further along have more positive attitudes, right? So that matches what we would expect from an authenticity standpoint. But we really, again, wanted to see why, like psychologically, what's going on here. And this time we had two different explanations that we wanted to test. One is what we called action authenticity, but if you're familiar with the concept of cognitive dissonance at all, so cognitive dissonance means I believe one thing, but I'm acting in a different way. So we thought that by transitioning, people might be actually reducing the cognitive dissonance that they might be expressing, they might be feeling. So the idea is that I feel a certain gender inside, but I've been expressing myself as a different gender, so if I transition and align my gender expression with my gender identity, that reduces cognitive dissonance, and that might be the reason why we see these positive attitudes as a function of transition status. That's one explanation. The other explanation that we wanted to test was maybe it's more about, it's a process called self-verification. Self-verification is this notion that human beings just kind of generally have a need for other people to see us in the way that we see ourselves, that our self-concept needs to match what we think other people's self-concepts of ourselves is, right? So it's like, I think that you think about me the same way that I think about me. So you can sort of get that sort of concept. We thought that would be another potential explanation, that people are using, in this case, they're using my correct pronouns, they're using my new name, they're treating me as the gender that I feel that I am. And this one is the one that's most closely tied to coworker support, right? So the first one is just, I'm expressing myself in a way that is authentic and is consistent. And the other one is, other people are treating me in a way that I want to be treated. So we tested both of these using structural equation modeling, and found that both of them are related. The first part is that if you transition, then you are feeling more authentic in the way that you're acting, and you're also feeling like other people are treating you more authentically. But when you look at the rest of the model, it seems like, well, what we found is that relational authenticity is the only one that fully mediates, fully explains that relationship. So it seems like, again, having your coworkers be supportive and affirming of your identity matters more than just expressing your identity in a way that you feel is important to you. So all of this sort of points in the same direction, right? Coworkers are important. And at this point, I was still in grad school, and I was finishing, I was working on my dissertation, and I was thinking, let's do something about coworkers. Let's figure out, it's clear that coworkers are important, let's see what the literature says about coworkers, and then I'll do my dissertation on that. I went to Google Scholar, allies in the workplace, and nothing, right? There wasn't really anything that came out. So we started actually by doing focus groups, so just by asking people about those experiences. There was a little bit of literature coming from counseling psychology, so how to be a good ally as a therapist for mostly gay and lesbian clients, and then some stuff related to educational context too, so how as a university or as a higher ed institution do you be an ally for students, right? But there wasn't anything related to workplace at that time, so we did focus groups, and we wanted to get the perspective of both the allies and the minority group. So we chose gay and lesbian and bisexual employees as the minority group for this. It could have been any group. And then we asked some allies to come in as well, and we asked them questions. We asked them the same questions, but for their perspective. So what does it mean for you to be an ally? What does it mean for someone to be an ally for you, right? Those types of different perspectives. So we analyzed the data, and we found a lot of things that were in common. So both groups kind of surface the same types of things. One of them is that contact breeds allies. So we're interested in what creates allies. Why do people become allies? And we know, the contact hypothesis is really, really robust phenomenon in psychology, that if you know somebody from that group, you're more likely to have positive attitudes about that group. So we saw that here, but there were two types of contact that seemed to emerge the most in these focus groups as being particularly influential. One is being a family member of somebody who's gay or lesbian, or being a really close friend, like a BFF type of situation. Another one was having an egalitarian sort of self-concept and then seeing something happen, like witnessing discrimination against somebody that you affiliated with. So it was this they're my friend, or I need to protect this person who is experiencing wrongful discrimination. So another thing that both groups said was that if you are an ally for gay people, then people are going to probably think that you're gay, because why else would you want to put yourself in that situation? So that is another sort of common sense type of thing. Both groups also talked about context and management concerns, that it's really important to have management buy-in. So if you're going to try and be an ally or engage in allyship types of behaviors, it's less likely that you're going to do that if you feel like the organization's not going to be supportive of those types of things. And that certain industries are going to be more likely to be open to allyship behaviors, and that certain regions of the country are going to be more open to allyship. So that was another thing. The one that I think is the most interesting or the most practical, is the focus on gendered language and assumptions. So both groups really understood that certain terms meant certain things, and communicated either allyship sort of attitudes, or communicated that it was not an allyship sort of situation. So this notion of using the word like partner, and not assuming that people's partners are the opposite gender, and things like that. And I like that one because it's cheap, it's easy, it's not, we have to do a diversity training and train people how to do things. It's just, don't assume, and that's an easy sort of grassroots type of thing you can do. I say easy, it's not that easy actually, but it's not too difficult to do. Another thing that came through was this idea of mutual protection. So the allies sort of understood that because they weren't sexual orientation minorities, they had relative power, and they could wield that power in ways that the minorities couldn't do. And at the same time, the gay and lesbian participants understood and communicated that it was likely that the allies would be assumed to be gay. They might get hit on if they go out to certain establishments, and they wanted to make sure that the ally was not put in uncomfortable situations. They would turn them off to allyship behaviors, right? So I think it's important to understand the things that are common throughout these sorts of experiences. But what's more important and more interesting is where these disagreements happen. So where do we see differences where maybe the allies are doing or saying something and the minorities are saying, should not do that. That's not actually allyship behavior. So one of the questions was related to what sort of situations are you more or less likely to engage in allyship behavior? When does this sort of thing happen in workplace contexts? And the allies said that they were much more likely to sort of come to the rescue of a gay or lesbian employee, that if they're in the room and somebody's being actively discriminated against, that constitutes more of like a crisis, an emergency, and they're more likely to step in that type of context. Whereas if there was not active discrimination happening, if it was sort of like this like locker room talk kind of thing, like just amongst other coworkers where there weren't any gay and lesbian people around, they're more likely to let it slide because nobody's actively being hurt at that point. When you ask the gay and lesbian people, they said that's when you should do something the most, right? The sentiment seemed to be that if I'm in the room, I can probably handle it, and I can use your support, but if I'm not in the room, that's when I really need you to be there and to be the voice that I can't be, right? So there was a discrepancy where we see the time when it's needed the most from the perspective of the minorities is when it's least likely to happen from the perspective of the allies. Another thing that we saw was that there was this expectation, this eagerness to learn amongst the allies. So there was this sense of, I want to learn more, I want to be a really good ally, and I want to do as much as I can. But they relied on gay and lesbian people for information about the issues, about legal stuff, about sometimes sexual stuff also. Sometimes it was sort of inappropriate things, just to sort of understand the issues a little bit better, and the gay and lesbian employees mostly felt like you should learn that on your own. I'm not the voice of all gay people, and it's not my responsibility to teach you how to be a good ally. And the perspective was more like, find somebody else who is a good straight ally and have them teach you, or go on the internet and educate yourself, right? It's not my duty to teach you how to do this. Another one that came through was really just related to the idea of like, what makes you an ally? What defines allyship for you? And the allies said, well, if I identify as an ally, then I'm an ally. And I call myself an ally, and I can be an ally. And if I mess up sometimes, or if I don't be an ally in times when I should have been, it's okay, because I'm just learning and I'm still an ally, right? And the gay and lesbian employees did not agree with that. It was more like, no, you're going to call yourself an ally, you need to do allyship behaviors. You need to engage and confront prejudice and be the voice, and if you don't get to call yourself an ally. You can call yourself whatever you want, but you have to kind of walk the walk, right? The one that I think is most important is this discrepancy where the allies, again, want to learn, and they want to intervene, and they want to say something, especially in these sort of heat of the moment types of situations where somebody says something and it's like, oh, I'm not sure if that was really the right thing to say, but they don't know what to do. They don't know what to say, they don't know how to say it, they don't know if they're going to be perceived as, they're going to say something incorrect and sort of undermine their efforts. And they're a little bit also unsure about whether or not it's their place. Am I going to make things worse, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and that really acts as a barrier to engaging in behaviors. And of course, the gay and lesbian people said, we need allies. Every social movement has benefited from allies, and without allies, it's not going to change, right? We need the support and the benefit of the allies. So we took this information and then we thought, well, what's the next thing that we should really look at? Well, what should allies be doing, right? Again, there's not any literature, any sort of studies that have looked at what do allies do? What do they say in a concrete sort of fashion? So what we did was we designed a couple of different scenarios based on past literature from social psychology looking at prejudice confrontation. So the idea is that somebody says something prejudiced, and then some sort of a bystander or maybe somebody from the target group themselves says something and confronts and says, hey, you shouldn't say that, it sounds wrong, think about the way that you talk. And there are a couple of different dimensions from that literature. None of it has been used in workplace context before. It's all sort of like hypothetical or like chatting online with a stranger type of thing. So we created a couple of different scenarios, and we wanted to see what sort of factors are influential in the type of confrontation you can engage in. So one factor is the state of calmness or hostility that you can engage in as a confronter. So you can imagine yelling, screaming, cursing, being a very angry sort of ally that just puts that person in their place and sets the tone for this not being acceptable. Or very calm, reasonable, no cursing, normal tone of voice type of confrontation. So this is one thing that has been identified in past literature as being potentially important. Another one was the identity of the confronter. So The research that had come before in these non-workplace contexts indicated fairly strongly that if you are an ally, you're perceived as being more legitimate, you're perceived as not having like a dog in the fight, you're not biased, you're not advocating for your own group, you tend to have more power, you tend to receive less backlash, so allies should have more of an impact than somebody who's advocating on behalf of themselves or advocating on behalf of their group, okay? So that was another thing that we manipulated in the videos. And the last thing was actually the directness of the language. So in some past studies, they had used language that was sort of indirect, like, we should all think about our language, and this type of thing might make some people uncomfortable, and sort of like a vague type of thing, versus a more direct, you said this, you sound racist, you should stop, right? It's like targeted at the person, like you are the problem and you said this, versus it's a general social phenomenon, it's kind of an abstract sort of thing. So indirect versus direct. So we added those into the video. So some videos are calm or hostile, direct or indirect, and confrontations engaged by an ally or somebody who identifies themselves as a member of the group. So I'll show you two examples of this. The first one is, I think, the aggressive, the hostile, direct target group member confronting. So I can show you what participants saw.
Hey, I'm glad you're early for the meeting too, because there's a question that I want to run by you about this project. What is our overhead budget? Because I cannot find it anywhere in my paperwork.
I think actually Charlie had that information.
Oh, have you seen Charlie lately? He hasn't been at his desk for the past couple days.
He got fired on Monday. I'm not sure exactly why. I think the bosses found out he was gay or something. You know how they are about that sort of thing.
Really?
Yeah, it might be for the best, I'm not sure why he has to be gay at work. If he just kept it to himself, he probably could have avoided the whole situation.
Well, I'm gay, and I don't see why it's such a damn problem. You should really try to think about gay people in a way that's less prejudiced. You sound like some sort of homophobic asshole to me.
So you can see it's very hostile type of situation. This is like the extreme sort of thing. The contrast, I can show you this one. The beginning of the video is exactly the same. So we use the same
Hey, I'm glad you're early for the meeting too, because there's a question that I want to run by you about this
You'll see there's a cut at the very end, and that's where we inserted
I cannot find it anywhere in my paperwork.
I think actually Charlie had that information.
Oh, have you seen Charlie lately? He hasn't been at his desk for the past couple days.
He got fired on Monday. I'm not sure exactly why. I think the bosses found out he was gay or something. You know how they are about that sort of thing.
Really?
Yeah, it might be for the best, I'm not sure why he has to be gay at work. If he just kept it to himself, he probably could have avoided the whole situation.
Well, I'm not gay, and I don't see why it's such a big problem. I think people should really think about gay people in a way that is less prejudiced. I feel like a lot of times, gay people do not get equal treatment in our society. You know what I mean?
So you can see the difference, right? And all the videos were pilot tested, they were based on past research, they were counterbalanced so that some of the, we actually did, we had the actors reverse roles so that it wasn't just particular to that person. Big mess in terms of data, but we did it and it turned out okay, because what we found, we wanted to see what are the perceptions of the confronter, because one of the things that we saw in the focus groups is, I don't want to say something because I might say something wrong, or I might escalate the situation, and I don't want people to blame me, right? I don't want to insert myself in a situation a situation that might make things worse. And you can see that as long as the confronter wasn't engaged in the hostile, aggressive, asshole calling situation, then it was pretty much fine. So we had a control condition where it was the same two actors, but they engaged in a disagreement about some menial sort of task, right? So it was clear that they didn't agree, but it wasn't about being gay or getting fired or confronting prejudice or anything like that. So we have sort of a neutral interaction. As long as if you're calm, you are just as good as having a mild disagreement. And if you're hostile, And especially if you're hostile and direct, people don't like you engaging in that type of confrontation, right? Then we wanted to see what are the perceptions of the perpetrator, so the person who said the homophobic thing. And this is kind of like the extent to which blame is placed on the perpetrator. So again, the perpetrator says the exact same thing in all situations. It's only different in terms of how they are treated as a response. So you can see here, confronting in a calm and direct way seems to be the best, right? So statistically significantly better than the others. So that's kind of nice because those things together sort of point us to what's the best strategy, right? The whole purpose of this was to, okay, I want to be an ally, what do I do, how do I do it, and how do I say it? And based on these two sort of bits of data, we can sort of suggest you should be calm, but you should be direct. So it's not completely that you're being abstract and you're saying we should all, you're directly addressing the issue and saying you said this thing, but in a calm sort of manner, right? So that's, yeah, absolutely.
About the scale on these, what is this a measurement of?
It's a aggregate of like perceptions of that person. So it's like friendly, it's I think they're intelligent, I would want to be friends with them, I think they'd be a good coworker. It's sort of an amalgam of I like this person.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
so it's sort of, you could say that it's kind of multidimensional, but factor analysis puts it as one sort of likability score. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the other piece of this is we asked about intentions to confront in the future. So as a participant, as a bystander, pretend that this is somebody that you saw, this is an incident that you saw in your workplace. What's the likelihood that you would engage in a confrontation? And again, as long as you're not hostile, you're being a good role model for others. So you're more likely to inspire confrontation among bystanders if you engage in a calm type of confrontation. So it all points the same direction, right? And we would think, great, we now have the answer, but there's a problem. Because we know that this is a hypothetical situation, these aren't actual employees, and we know that things sort of are different with actual employees because they work together, and there's a time factor, right? So imagine this sort of thing happens. What happens later? So what we actually did was this was my dissertation data, and we had collected all the data, and then we wanted to see time lagged effects. So I told a little white lie. I emailed all the participants back, and I said, I'm working on my dissertation, and I'm almost done, but I lost all my data. It was corrupted, I lost it. It's a big problem. Would you please take 2 minutes and just fill out a short questionnaire so I can graduate? And everybody was very kind. And they did, and so we didn't have them watch the videos again. You know, it was remember the video you saw 3 weeks ago, just what do you think about these people again? We showed them the pictures of each person, and what we found, we took out this, there was no impact of being direct or indirect, so we wanted to look at hostility now. And what we found was that in the hostile condition, it was rated lower at time 1, which we saw before. But then when you ask people 3 weeks later, it flipped, and it flipped dramatically. So this is something that we don't see very often. So now, the people who saw the hostile confrontation rated it poorly when they saw it, but 3 weeks later thought, okay, that was actually very effective. And the people who saw the calm confrontation rated it highly at the time, and then 3 weeks later said, that wasn't effective at all, or it was less effective, right? So, crap, right? And it just, it just kind of points to the fact that this is a complicated thing, and that people's perceptions change over time. And the easy explanation is that negative information, negative things are more salient. You remember negative things more. So it might just have more of a psychological impact to be the screaming, cursing asshole if you're not working with that person long term, right? So there's nuance here that we're looking at now. So in terms of what we've done since then, we felt like we had a pretty good understanding of what allyship is in organizations, how confrontation might work, and we then developed a training, a skill building workshop. So the idea is to overcome all of the barriers that we identified in the focus groups and in other survey data that we've seen and in other research that's been published in other contexts, to overcome these, to increase confidence and engage in more allyship behaviors. And it's based on, if you're familiar with, there's a really classic bystander intervention literature that sort of shows that if there's only one bystander, then that bystander is more likely to intervene. If there's more bystanders, then it's less likely that each person will intervene. Part of that model outlines the decision-making process that people engage in when they're deciding whether or not to intervene, right? So you have to identify that there's a problem, recognize that it's actually a crisis, which we saw sort of in the focus groups, right? I'm only gonna intervene if somebody's right now getting discriminated against, not if it's not as much of a crisis. You have to identify it as a crisis. You have to know what to say and, or what sort of action to take, and then you take action, right? So we're breaking down each one of those barriers that could prevent somebody from engaging in allyship behaviors. There it is, theoretically derived. It's called the confronting prejudice responses model. And then we combined that sort of information from social psychology with some of the more contemporary organizational training principles. So things like perspective taking, empathy building, role modeling, goal setting, things that we see working in other types of trainings and organizations. And one of the parts that I think is really key is we have a role modeling section where people can see different types of confrontation styles. So we've expanded beyond just confront in a calm and direct way to identifying six different confrontation styles. So maybe asking a question or invoking the norms of the organization, like, I don't think people around here really feel that way, or how would you feel if you were in that situation, right? So it's sort of invoking these different psychological states because we recognize that not everybody's gonna feel comfortable being a calm and direct ally in every situation, right? So we are toying with that and providing different types of situations. So now they can watch the beginning part of the video where the harassment sort of happens, and then see 6 different options, and then think about which option they might like to engage in, right? And of course we have recommendations about which ones we think are more or less effective, but we have to meet people with where they are. So we're thinking deeply about that. We've done the training with about 800 people in the Portland area across 4 different organizations. And we do see increases in knowledge about allyship, confidence in allyship, and willingness to engage in allyship behaviors directly after the training, right? So caveat is we can test you right before, we can test you right after, but the organizations didn't have the ability, the bandwidth to do like longitudinal data collection that includes organizational outcomes, like are there differences in terms of climate after the ally training? Are there differences in productivity or motivation or perceived fit? So we don't have those things, but what we do have is encouraging. So we've taken the initial 800 and we, like I mentioned, we're creating new videos using flash animation to do these sort of situations. We also created role-playing situations. So you watch the role modeling examples, and then you're given with a partner, you have to say something sort of racist or whatever, prejudice to this other person, and they have to respond. So you practice responding in a safe sort of environment to get over, again, that feeling of, I don't know what to say, I don't have a script for this. It's kind of like a script-based behavior modeling training. So the idea is that once you've engaged in these uncomfortable situations here, you're more likely to engage in them when it's a real type of situation. Yeah.
And with that training, how did, I guess I shouldn't make this assumption, but is there like a taking into account, like, you know, of how different phrasings can trigger people in different ways, especially if, you know, like the first video you showed of the person who identified as gay is perceived hostile, and, you know, a lot of times people are just, we're triggered, and then if you constantly heard the same thing overall in your life, at some point you're just not going to be like calm about it, you're just ignoring. And so in these trainings, is there like a taking into account of like, how do people, because there's one thing to be an ally, but then there's the other piece of if you're the person in the group, how do you manage your mental and emotional health to react as well?
Yeah, so we do, that's a good question. We do cover things like self-care is really important as an ally. We also talk a lot about consensual allyship. So one of the things that comes through in the focus groups and a lot of the data that we've collected is this really fine line between being an ally and helping, and being an ally and taking over and stealing voice, and sort of ironically reinforcing these patriarchal power dynamics, these power differences. So you'd want to be a good ally that works with the minority group but doesn't take over, because you're sort of establishing again, like, you need help and I can help you, and then that creates those, sort of things. So it's pretty in depth. What we try and do also is get a good sense of where the organization is. So in an ideal situation, we do a needs assessment and see what people are feeling in the organization, and then we can tailor, the training to whatever's going on right there. So I can show you one of the organizations. So these are before and after statistics. They're all statistically significant. Even the first one is a really big sample size. And the first one was a mental health and addiction counseling organization. So they scored really high in allyship readiness at the beginning. So there's kind of a ceiling effect, but we still got a little bit of a boost, and that boost was statistically significant. So we can see here that even the gray lines, different organizations are going to be starting at different places. So we're trying to be responsive to that as well. Some other things that we're working on that I wasn't sure we were going to have enough time, but we have like 5 more minutes. So we're also looking at identity progression. So we recognize that being an ally isn't like an all or nothing sort of thing. You kind of start maybe at 0, and then we've identified 5 different stages that people tend to go through. And the idea with the training is that we're sort of going to try and move you from whatever stage you're in to the next stage. And one of the stages is specifically reserved for trying to engage in allyship behaviors after you've done some learning and education and messing up, right? So the idea is that you're gonna, we call it stumbling. You're gonna mess up, you're gonna say the wrong thing, you're gonna say something in a time when you shouldn't have said something, you're gonna not say something when you should have said something, and just recognizing that that's okay. The last stage is actually after that, and we characterize that as this like hypothetical, theoretical nirvana that nobody ever becomes a perfect ally, but if you did, it's called integration, where you can be a good ally and not overstep your bounds and know exactly what to do in all situations, right? So that's a situation that doesn't exist for anybody, even people who do this research. And the other thing that we did with the training is we took the data, the 800 people, and we did scale validations and streamlined the training down. So we've identified 2 particular types of behaviors that allies can engage in. One is more of a supportive role, so it's providing interpersonal support, a shoulder to cry on, somebody to vent to, hey, I saw this happened, are you okay? Do you want to talk about this sort of thing? So supportive allyship, and then the other one is more of an advocacy, so it's trying to get new policies, it's advocating for groups, it's talking to HR or trying to change the sort of the situation, not necessarily providing support to the person, but providing more instrumental types of support. So we have scales to measure those things as well, and a scale to measure perceived barriers to engaging in allyship behaviors. And we are trying to use the data as much as we can to make the training as efficient as possible, too. So, yes?
Maybe 2 quick questions. So I'm in the healthcare research arena, and we just did some work in what we call SOGI variables, which are sexual orientation and gender identity. And one of the conversations that kept coming out when we were working with clinicians and clinics was and probably you and probably a lot of folks are versed in implicit and explicit bias. And what they're talking about there's the term microaggressions that are brought up with that implicit bias. That was a lot of focus with clinics and getting the conversations more comfortable and proactive in the clinics. And I was kind of curious how that worked or works in the framework within maybe a little different type of workplace where it's patient-provider role and reporting. And then on another conversation on that too is, and I really like that comment earlier, where people are in different types of emotional states, where some folks are just not in an emotional state, and there's a certain behavior, often maybe a little more logical, a little more thoughtful, versus when higher emotional states, people just do things that they go, I can't believe I did that, or they would not think they would ever do something like that, and how to get people to be able to work through those situations when they do happen, that is more helpful for everybody when they go through that.
Yeah, great questions. So the implicit bias, so that's typically what you see with diversity trainings, right? We're going to train people about implicit bias, and if we train them, then they'll stop doing it, right? It doesn't work. We all know this by now, right? It doesn't work. And if you look at the training, the organization training literature, specifically with diversity training, it's abysmal. It either doesn't work or it makes things worse, actually, because there's backlash too. People don't like having to go to diversity training because that implies that you are racist, right? And most people don't identify as racist. So that's why we did it this way, right? So we call it an ally skill building workshop because people like building skills and they like being allies, and it's more proactive and it's more of like a positive psychology sort of spin on it. And it gives concrete things. So one of the things that we have in the workbook, we have sort of take-home exercises, and you can think about, imagine yourself, you in this situation, and the matrix that says, okay, well, if I identify as somebody who typically would give this type of response, given the situation, here's what I might say, right? So it's like a grid that is a good, not a crutch, but like a tool that can be used for afterwards. So we don't cover implicit bias because I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is people are willing and wanting to, but they don't know what to do. So we focus there. The second question about, I just lost it. Remind me what the second question was.
The conversation of when, and it was nicely said earlier, is just when, how people respond when there are more emotionally charged situations. You can watch something from afar and there's a certain degree of emotional connection, but actually when you're in the situation, things act out differently versus more of a detached, and then how you think you would react, how you think we should react, and then how to help people bridge when that emotional real situation is to move them along versus, and I think you were alluding to some of that earlier, but on that one.
For sure, that falls under the like self-care part of it. This idea that oftentimes is going to be an emotional state. People might have experienced discrimination for a long time, and it's just bubbling up, waiting for an opportunity to sort of unleash itself upon everybody. So we talk about trying to manage that, but I think that's something, it's either going to happen or it's not. So I think with the training we can try and acknowledge that might be something that we can name, and then provide cues for people to sort of maybe understand, like, oh, maybe this isn't the correct emotional state to engage right now, but I don't think we have, that's not a big focus of this, so I don't think we have a really strong way of dealing with that. Yeah.
I just had one more question after hearing you speak in regards to those points. So for this, and I guess just to make sure I'm clear, this is more about like allyship and showing the trainings. That's what they focus on. And I know in the videos, just for context, I'm from North Carolina and I moved here for grad school and I don't work here. but the videos those examples are great, but I think also like society is kind of, you still see examples like that, but I don't know if that's always like the case nowadays where someone's like, they outrightly say what they do or do not like, and you know, particularly in Oregon, there's a lot of institutionalized issues and a lot of things that are subliminally said, which goes back to like the microaggression point. And so have y'all done anything around trainings of even helping people to, because you want to show up as an ally, and it's not just, oh, someone said X thing about me that's harmful. Bluntly, maybe it's noticing that linguistically or other ways that are just subliminally right beneath the surface that still have that big impact.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, in the initial trainings that we did, we actually created 30 different role-playing scenarios, and then had people go through them, and then we asked for each scenario to give a rating of how effective was it, how much did it make you think, how believable was it. So we collected data on each scenario, and then used those data to either eliminate scenarios or rewrite scenarios, or figure out which scenarios should then be converted into the role modeling versus the future role playing versus the take-home training book. So everything that we have now in the training has some sort of a validation and data behind it. And we created, across the 30, we created, I think 20 of them were verbal instances of discrimination, and then 10 were nonverbal. So if somebody's being excluded or it seems like something might be happening, and then how would you respond? And we stratified across, I think, 7 different identity groups. So race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, ability status, so age. We tried to cover a wide variety of things, and actually found that some of the scenarios just don't make sense. People have a hard time with gender identity, turns out. Yeah. These are great questions. So just to wrap up, back to this picture again, the whole idea with like allyship is that you want to be a voice and be sort of a dissenting voice in especially situations where it seems like not being that voice could perpetuate negativity, harassment, incivility, microaggressions, these types of things. So it's really about minority influence, minority as an ally, right, in those types of situations. And that's what I have. So thank you so much again.